Welcome to the Book Nook podcast. I'm so excited for our deep dive today. It's one I've been looking forward to for a while now.
Me too. And for all our listeners out there, if you want to follow along and haven't already snagged a copy, there's a link in the description to buy the book.
Today's deep dive is focused on Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. You know, it's considered one of those truly iconic novels. We're going to unpack what makes this book so compelling. We've got a fantastic mix of sources for this one, some academic reviews, some more casual discussions, even some personal reflections.
It really gives us a well-rounded view. We'll try to navigate the intricacies of this novel together, offer some clear insights, a good understanding of its significance and what makes it tick.
Perfect. Sounds like a plan. So Mrs. Dalloway was published back in 1925, and it basically revolves around Clarissa Dalloway on a single day in London as she preps for a party.
Yeah, and that concept right there, a whole novel in a single day, already makes you think, that's kind of interesting.
Right. What's your take on that? Why focus on such a short time frame?
Well, it's almost like by concentrating on such a limited time, Woolf makes that present moment really important. I mean, the entire novel plays out in a day. But through that day, we see Clarissa's entire life, her past, her relationships, her thoughts, all come together.
Like a snapshot.
Yeah.
But the snapshot reveals a much bigger picture.
Exactly.
And of course, we can't talk about Mrs. Dalloway without talking about Woolf's writing style, that stream of consciousness that she's so famous for. One source, I think it was a reader reviewing the book, said it felt pretty overwhelming at first. Like the story moved so fast, there are a lot of characters, and it was almost like making your head spin.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
But they also said that once you kind of get into that rhythm, that's when you see how brilliant it really is.
And that feeling of being overwhelmed, kind of like being swept up in a torrent of thoughts, it's completely intentional. Woolf wants you to feel that way. Think of it like you're listening in on someone's internal monologue, completely unfiltered. One thought leads to another, memories pop up out of nowhere, feelings trigger other thoughts. It's very natural the way our minds actually work.
And, I mean, Woolf isn't just telling us a story here. She's literally bringing us right inside the minds of her characters, which, like that reader said, creates this amazing sense of intimacy, like you're really experiencing the characters' lives from the inside out.
And that in just one day?
Exactly. And in addition to Clarissa's perspective, we also get a significant chunk of the story from Septimus Smith's point of view. He's a World War I veteran who's dealing with what they used to call shell shock, which we now know as PTSD. Woolf doesn't shy away from portraying his experiences, both the horrific aspects of war and the emotional toll it takes.
Right, and what's even more interesting, Clarissa and Septimus never actually meet in the novel.
They don't. Huh, I didn't even realize that.
Yeah, but their inner lives, their struggles, they kind of seem to mirror each other. One reviewer talked about this and said that Woolf presents them almost as opposing halves or even corresponding doubles, like they're connected somehow, even though they never cross paths. And that brings up this really interesting question of what sanity really means, especially in the aftermath of something as traumatic as World War I. Septimus is obviously suffering, but his pain is understandable. It makes sense. And it kind of makes you wonder about how society defines normal and how we deal with the Vowns who are struggling mentally.
Especially back then.
Exactly.
And speaking of context, I think it's so fascinating how London itself almost becomes a character in the novel. As we follow Clarissa around, from Westminster to Bond Street to St. James's Park, every location seems to trigger these vivid memories and chance encounters.
And, it's important to remember that this was London in the post-World War I era, a time of huge change, rapid modernization. There are cars everywhere, buses. These new modes of transportation, they kind of represent this new sense of freedom, And it's such a contrast to the more traditional world that Clarissa grew up in, the world where she made some of those big life choices, like who to marry. One commentator even mentioned how those modern conveniences we take for granted now, they just didn't exist when Clarissa was making those pivotal decisions.
Wow, it's like the changing city is reflecting this change in Clarissa, too, and how she's looking back on her life.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there are those big themes, like memory and how the past shapes the present, and of course the complexities of mental health. We've already touched on it. But that stream of consciousness style, while a little disorienting at first, really does capture how our minds work. One thought can lead to a flood of memories and feelings, and it can feel kind of random.
But isn't it interesting? One reader said there's something comforting about seeing that on the page. Like, it's okay that our minds wander like that. It's natural. And Woolf just captures that so brilliantly.
I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling of your mind just going off on tangents. It's reassuring in a weird way.
Absolutely. It's like she's saying, hey, this is how we all think. It's okay.
And it's not just random either. It's intentional. One perspective I came across suggested that the novel is really exploring how we remember the past and how places can evoke those memories so powerfully. Clarissa and Peter Walsh, her old flame, they're constantly looking back at their past decisions, wondering, what if? It really emphasizes how much our relationships and the choices we make, even those made years ago, stay with us.
Absolutely. And Peter Walsh especially, he really lingers in Clarissa's mind, doesn't he? It's like she's forced to confront this path not taken, and it speaks to the enduring power of those connections and maybe even a little bit of regret, too.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's also that really important layer of commentary on marriage and what society expected of women in the early 20th century. You see this especially with Clarissa's daughter, Elizabeth. It's like she represents a whole new generation with different aspirations, and marriage doesn't necessarily define her in the same way it did her mother.
Absolutely. And that's a really important point because, as some interpretations suggest, Elizabeth's independence and the potential for her to have a life outside those traditional roles really contrasts with the more limited options that were available to women of Clarissa's generation. It's like a subtle nod to how society is starting to change.
It's fascinating to see those generational differences play out in the novel. And of course, we have to talk about Septimus. His character serves as this incredibly powerful reminder of the impact war has on mental health, especially back then when PTSD wasn't really understood. Seeing his suffering set against the backdrop of London's vibrant, busy social scene really highlights how invisible the wounds of war can be.
And it's heartbreaking because there's just this lack of understanding and treatment for his condition. He's basically told to rest. And that just goes to show how limited mental health care was at that time. You read about his hallucinations, his inner turmoil, and it just evokes this sense of horror at what he's going through and the profound isolation he feels.
It really makes you appreciate how far we've come, but also how much work still needs to be done when it comes to understanding and supporting mental health.
Absolutely.
And speaking of support, if you're enjoying this deep dive into Mrs. Dalloway, we'd love it if you could take a moment to subscribe to the Booknook podcast.
And maybe leave a review, too. We always appreciate hearing your thoughts.
Exactly. Okay, so we talked about Septimus's struggles, but there's also all this interesting imagery associated with the female characters, particularly birds. What's your take on all the bird symbolism?
There are a lot of interpretations out there, but some readings focus on how those images of birds, whether they're caged or flying free, could represent this feeling of being trapped or limited. Even though Clarissa is at the center of this sophisticated social circle, there's this underlying sense that she's bound by societal expectations.
Yeah, I can see that. And then you have that motif of Big Ben chiming throughout the day. It's not just marking the passage of time. It's almost like this constant reminder of mortality.
Yeah, that ticking clock, it really emphasizes how finite life is. And like one commentator pointed out, many of the characters, except maybe for young Elizabeth, are grappling with the consequences of the choices they've already made. Time just keeps moving forward, and it has this weight to it in the novel.
And even though that stream of consciousness style can be a bit challenging at first, reviewers consistently praise Woolf's writing. It's just stunning, so rich with imagery, metaphors, symbolism. You can't just skim this book. You have to slow down and savor it to really appreciate the nuances of her language and how much depth she gives her characters.
One reader, and I loved this description, said that Woolf digs out beautiful caves behind my characters. It really captures that sense of humanity, humor, and depth that she reveals in their inner lives. You just can't deny her mastery of language.
Absolutely. So, as we've seen, Mrs. Dalloway, even in just our little exploration here, is packed with layers of meaning, bold stylistic choices, and these really insightful observations about what it means to be human. It makes you think about the power of memory, how society changes, those hidden struggles with mental health, and that ever-present flow of time.
It's a masterpiece, there's no doubt about it. The way Woolf weaves these different perspectives and themes together, all within the framework of a single day, is just remarkable. It's no wonder it's still resonating with readers almost a century later. It really makes you think about the inner lives of the people around us, doesn't it?
It really does. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Mrs. Dalloway. I hope you found it as fascinating as we did, and maybe it's given you some new insights to consider if you decide to read or reread the book.
And for those of you who do pick it up, think about how Woolf takes something as ordinary as a single day and uses it to reveal so much about the human experience.
Well said. Don't forget to check the link in the description to grab your copy of Mrs. Dalloway. And as we leave you today, ponder this. How many unseen worlds do we pass by each day, existing within the minds of the people we encounter?
Great question. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to the Book Nook Podcast.